Great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again for part 2 of this discussion. And we're really glad to have you all here. And I'm excited to have these panelists joining us. So to not take up too much time, we're going to let them introduce themselves briefly and let the discussion happen. And then please, if you have any questions, send them to the Q&A section and they'll be monitored at the end of the discussion. So I'll let you all get started.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rebecca Ginsburg, and I'm honored to be the moderator for this panel. We'll be going for an hour. I'm a professor at the University of Illinois, and I direct the Education Justice Project, which is a college and prison program. I've asked the panelists to be prepared to provide no more than 5-minute introductions about themselves, mostly focusing on their biography, because the next round of questions will have to do with the work that they do. So I can jump off by asking Nathan to please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Rebecca. My name is Nathan Stevens. I'm assistant professor in social work at Illinois State University. As it relates to this work, I'm a former community organizer that's worked for human rights and dignity. I have a bachelor's and a master's in social work and completed my doctorate in educational leadership and policy analysis. My research interest is around Black men and boys and their experiences with racism and racialized stress and trauma and the impact that those things have on their lives. And so I am a former member of the Board of Commissioners for the City of Carbondale Fire and Police Board of Commissioners. And I have done trainings, cultural competency and reducing racial profiling for Southern Illinois University Police Department and Bolingbrook, Illinois Police Department. And I had the honor and privilege of teaching a class at Danville Correctional Center for Educational Justice Project with the great Dr. Rebecca. Finally, I am a former inmate who spent 6 years in prison in Missouri and Oklahoma. And so that enables me to bring a very diverse and wide range of perspectives into this conversation.
Thanks so much, Nathan. We're glad you're here with us. Charlene, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Charlene Fletcher. I am the Emerging Voices postdoctoral research associate at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. I hold a PhD from Indiana University in US history. And prior to my graduate work, I was responsible for a very large reentry program in New York, New Jersey, and in the city of Philadelphia. I also, while in New York, was a lecturer of criminal justice for the City University of New York, helping to shed light on the criminal justice system for the students who were hoping to fill some of these roles that we're talking about this evening: police officer, correctional officer, social workers, prosecutors, so on and so forth. So I am glad to be here. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you for being here, and so glad that you are here. And the third panelist is Michael. Mike, can you tell us about yourself?
Hi. Sure, I'm Mike Schlosser. It says Michael, but I usually go by Mike unless I was in trouble from my mom when I was little. But I had a career in law enforcement. I'm a retired lieutenant with the Rantoul, Illinois Police Department. And when I retired in 2004, I became an instructor at the University of Illinois Police Training Institute, which a lot of people don't even realize that is actually a police academy. And we train over 800 different agencies in Illinois, from North, South, Naperville, Rockford, Southern Illinois, everywhere. So we are a police academy. But we're lucky enough to be associated with a major research institute. And when I started working at PTI, that's for short, that I started working on my PhD, and I became an instructor and an educator trainer for police recruits. But during that time, I started working on my PhD in education, which I did get how many years later? I think 2011, I actually earned my PhD in education. And pretty much all of my research and my dissertation and everything had to do with the intersection of police and race. And so I have been, since I became the director in 2012, I've been really working hard for police reform and how we can kind of have a paradigm shift in how we train and how we police. So yes, that's why I'm here today. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Mike. We're glad you're here. And I'm so impressed by the credentials and the experience, the lived experience and professional and academic experience of everybody on this panel. I'm sure we're going to have a really great discussion like last time. And I want to start by inviting each of you to talk about your current role, whether that's a professional role or a organization that you belong in, and how you seek through that current role to working with others, of course, to interrupt police violence or mass incarceration, which of course are the topics of today's panel. Can you tell us more about how your work intersects with the challenges of police violence and mass incarceration? And maybe we'll start backwards this time and ask Mike to go first. And
Sure.
again, can I just, before I let you go, Mike, I just want to say, I'm hoping that as the discussion gets going, there'll be a lot of crosstalk between the panelists and crosstalk from the audience. Please, audience, we can't see you, but we know you're there, and all the panelists really want you to put your comments and questions in the chat and engage with us. Thanks, Mike.
Sure, thank you. Well, I feel like I am in a position because not only am I the director of PTI and I am, responsible for training so many young recruits, but I'm also a former police officer and a white male. And I feel like in my position, not only do I, but I must have, must take the responsibility of making change in policing. And so I guess the most important things or the things that are closest to me are within the academy and within the training. And I'd like to just kind of describe the things that I've changed in our academy setting, which varies from others around the country. So first and foremost, we're not a boot camp. Okay, so many academies are still that, that military or paramilitary boot camp, and it's that kind of creates the warrior mentality. So our philosophy, our ideology is based more on the guardian mentality versus the warrior mentality. So what do we do to try to get rid of that? Well, all of our training is based on the adult learning model. And so within that adult learning model, we have a lot of scenario-based training and a lot of discussion and group talks because we want our young officers to go out. We want them to be problem solvers. We want them to be part of the community. We want them to be critical thinkers. And so throughout that scenario-based training, they get a lot of practice. Now, the state requires 40 hours of scenario-based training, but we actually provide 84 hours. And the vast majority of that involves what I call non-escalation and de-escalation training. Everybody's heard of de-escalation training, but how you interact with someone to begin with can keep things from escalating. So that has to be a huge emphasis on how we train. And then I thought, what other curriculum can I bring in to educate our recruits differently and they can have a broader educational gain from this. So I'm working with, since 2000, all of these things are pre-Ferguson, actually, just to let you know that, but I'm working with two brilliant professors here at the university, Helen Neville in educational psychology and Sundiata Chajwa in African-American studies. And we have been evolving, and it's still evolving, but we have been presenting to our recruits an additional 9 to 10 hours of what we call policing in a multiracial society class. And it involves a lot of things. It involves making sure awareness, knowledge, and skills, right? We need to be aware that we all have these assumptions and biases and stereotypes. We need to have knowledge of the, socio-historical, intersections of police with people and race. And, I think one of and the skills to be culturally competent when we're policing, but we need to be able to, go out there and do our jobs in the right way. So the last day of that, the last portion of that, we bring in a panel group, and that's usually that's usually the part that's like hits them in the face. It's like, yeah, this is real. We need to do work. So we have a panel come in, a very diverse panel, including police, and we have open discussions. And it's I think that's been very helpful. I also brought in LGBTQ ally training, and that's very important. And I'll be honest with you, that's very important to me. I have a transgender granddaughter, and she's beautiful and wonderful. And I know that her life might be a little bit difficult in today's society still, unfortunately. So that's something that I brought in. And then another course I brought in is called Wrongful Conviction, Avoidance and Awareness. And we want officers to learn best practices so that they don't get tunnel vision on who they think did something, so that they realize that, lineups and show ups for a victim who just witnessed a crime might not be super valid, so that they're making sure they're doing all of these things to help prevent that person from, arresting the wrong person, even though we know there's still other issues within the courts that still need to be dealt with beyond that. So, and I also, have the opportunity to speak with like the Illinois Sheriff's Association and Police Executive Research Forum and some of these bigger groups, because I'm trying to broaden things a little bit more so that it's like, I don't want to just, develop these young people and then have them go out and change the world. We need to start with the leadership. So that's kind of what's been going on with me here since 2011, 12-ish. So.
Wow, Mike, thank you. That's a really comprehensive response. Training, teaching, community building, and changing within the profession efforts that you're making there. I'm sure we'll have opportunity to bounce those things around a bit more. Charlene, what's your current role? What are you doing? What are you doing about police violence in this?
Let's see. In my role, well, first of all, my work revolves around the confinement of Black women specifically. And so in my role as a postdoc at Brown, I am working with undergraduates. I'm teaching a course right now called Say Her Name, Black Women in the Carceral Experience since 1865. And we have spent the semester exploring the incarceration of Black women, but also the collateral consequences of incarceration for Black women. So motherhood behind the wall, mothering people behind the wall, Black women in relationships with police violence, the silencing of Black women's experiences. So we talk about folks like sisters like Breonna Taylor. And so I see myself not only as an educator, because in the classroom, we have very diverse readings, but also it's important to me to bring that practical experience to the table. And it's a bit difficult in a virtual classroom. When I lived in New York, I used to take students to different prisons in New York State, and so that they could see both sides of the correctional experience, not just what they hear on television, not just what they read in the newspapers, but to understand that, you are interacting with people, and that's what's important. These are people. And I do my best in the classroom to make sure that students understand that, people are complex beings. They have complex situations. And it's important that you don't go into this field with this us versus them mentality. And so, all police academies aren't, and correctional academies aren't blessed to have folks who get it like Mike. And so what my goal is to ensure that students who want to travel down this professional path, I can't hold your hand through the academy, but at least I can give you a different sort of experience before you take your oath and before you move into the field. So in addition to teaching, I really still see myself as more of a mentor. I still serve as a mentor to a lot of my students that I had while teaching for the City University of New York. Some of them, they are in fact police officers now. Some of them are on the NYPD. Others are social workers. One of my students was just admitted to graduate school, and she wants to get a graduate degree in psychology so she can continue to work with families. So that's how I see my current role. I do very much miss the work that I did inside of New York's correctional facility or penal facilities, but that's my role now.
Thank you, Charlene. So there's quite a bit of overlap between you and Mike in that you're both involved in teaching prospective or current police officers. Michael, the people you teach, are they police officers yet, or they're police in training?
Yes and no. So let me explain that. So when a police agency hires someone, they've been hired, right? So they're technically a police officer, but they're not certified yet. So it's up to the agency on who they hire. Then it's up to the agency on which one of the 7 police academies in Illinois they want to send them to. And then after they complete the academy and pass all the testing, then they're state certified. And then they go back to their agency for field training.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know that, although I think I've heard you say it before, but thank you for reminding me. So that's interesting because it sounds like both Charlene and Mike have some confidence in the role of education to produce change within policing structures, and the role of training to produce change within policing structures, which is, you know, there are other folks out there that are saying, no, education and training aren't going to make a difference. We really need to think about abolishing the entire system. So I'm hoping that's going to come up and percolate a bit in our discussions, or maybe through the chat. And I want to turn it over to Nathan now. What are you doing in your work these days, Nathan?
Well, very similar to Charlene and Mike. As an assistant professor in social work, I'm obviously talking with folks who, you know, are wanting to help in terms of social services. But we also know that there's a strong correlation between poverty and crime, right? Which is ultimately going to be the other side of this equation. And so hopefully using, you know, that experience and that influence, but then also some of the research that I'm conducting that when we talk about the experiences and the impact of becoming involved with law enforcement, becoming involved with the penal institution. Like it's a colleague of mine who spent 27 years in prison, right? And he just got out probably within the last, I think, 18 months or so in Missouri. And so he became involved in a relationship. Now he has a 2-year-old daughter, so it must have been a little longer than that. But the point is, my immediate concern and thought was, you know, you've spent 27 years behind walls, and then you have a child, and you know you haven't mitigated a lot of the trauma and stuff that you've experienced, right? So little concerned that might be passed on genetically, as people like Dr. Joy DeGruy has suggested that it's possible to pass that on biologically. But then also my research hopes to highlight some of the discrepancies between the narratives that are shared versus the lived realities, right? And so, you know, the bad apples versus it's a few bad apples versus, you know, that kind of thing. What does the research say, right? And then finally, I'm also working on, I've submitted a grant to where I'm trying to get kind of this discussion group around the book, you know, My Grandmother's Hands, right? So I've submitted a grant proposal for that. And so now I'm working on something that is going to be urging municipal and state authorities to shift the protection of police officers, so to speak. And I'm advocating for police officers to be required to have professional liability insurance, very similar to medical doctors and like, for example, myself as a social worker in private practice. And so what my goal behind that is that, you know, a doctor is very mindful and a social worker is very mindful of how they engage with patients, right? And understanding that if I'm a neurosurgeon and I make a mistake, then I may be required to have some type of punitive damage and have to have some insurance for that. And so I'm going to be asking municipalities and states to not cover that would be paid for by the individual officer, and that the insurance industry itself will regulate its rates. And so there's a proposal in New York that models this. And the idea is that if you're having several complaints and these kind of things, right, you've been accused of all of this different stuff, that could impact the rate that you pay, right? And so therefore, if you're not, you know, whether you're guilty or innocent, something is going on to the point where I feel we need to move beyond that someone did something within policy, right? But what if it's a bad policy? What if your policy is way too permissive? And so basically the bottom line in my thinking is I want to situate police officers between making the decision between being able to provide for their families and themselves or harming citizens, right? So you'll have to kind of make that choice in terms of, do I do the right thing, or you know, and be able to provide for my family, or do I resist the trainings from folks like Mike about implicit bias and all this kind of other stuff? Because I think for the most part, there is some cognitive dissonance in terms of what someone thinks versus what someone does, right? And so they may be processing a lot of what the trainings and education and all this other stuff that they're receiving, but how does that play out in the field? And so when we look at these disparities between the killing of unarmed Black and brown people, it appears that you might have done the implicit bias training, but it seems like it hasn't reached the core of who someone is, because these things continue to occur. And so I know real quick, the state of Illinois is also looking at certification. The Attorney General is looking at certification qualifications, which is what Mike is alluding to. You need to become a police officer, and the impact that, you know, some trainings and these reports and all this kind of other stuff. Something has to be done to where accountability is at the individual level, because I feel like systemically we cannot count on police chiefs, we cannot count on unions, we cannot count on divisions, et cetera, to make this accountable. And to kind of support my point, the School of Social Work there at U of I recently had a conversation with Isaac Ford Jr., who's a former police officer in the Atlanta area. And he told in his experience that, you know, when he went and reported some bad apples, that all of a sudden they came for him, right? And so again, that flies in the face of this. There's a few bad apples where you had one of the good apples trying to curtail the behavior of a bad apple, and the good apple was subsequently basically ran out of the forest. And so how do we take that away to where it's not a matter of, you know, if the chief or whomever decides to do something different, we'll have an external industry with the insurance industry that can say, based on statistical, you know, models and algorithms, you are such and such levels of risk. And so therefore there's a certain, you know, and again, we could talk more about that, but that's just kind of some of the stuff that I'm working on right now.
Thank you, Nathan. I want to ask Michael and Charlene too, if she wants to respond to what you've been speaking about. I also want to acknowledge there's a question in the chat, and yeah, we'll get to your question soon. But before that, I want to remind us that we're here at a talk sponsored by the University of Illinois Library. I'm so grateful to Sarah, I think, who put My Grandmother's Hands in the chat. Nathan, you also mentioned that book on epigenetics. If you could put at least the title or the author in the chat. And Charlene and Michael too, in honor of our hosts, if you could please, if books are coming that are resonating, books that you're, Charlene, you mentioned, did you mention a book yet? Maybe you didn't, but
I have. I don't know. If it comes to mind, I'll
put it in the chat so people can leave this event with a reading list of some of the themes and issues that are emerging. Thank you, thank you. Mike, I want to give you a chance to.
Yeah. Nathan makes some awesome points. I'll just, and let me tell you a story. I'm a storyteller. So I have talked to numerous chiefs and sheriffs around the state over the years. And there have been times where the chief may have said, this person does not belong in law enforcement. They have, violated our code of ethics. They have done excessive force, or they have done whatever. And I fired them. And then the union is so strong, right? So the union then comes back, and then they have their attorneys. And then one particular incident, this chief had to rehire this person because of the power of the union. And it wasn't that much longer that he did something else and he was fired and he didn't come back. But so when it comes to that accountability, sometimes the chiefs are like, yes, I want to get rid of this person. And then what happens is, so we don't have this, what we should have is this like database saying if somebody gets fired for something, other departments should know about that, because they may go somewhere else, even another state, and they get hired as a police officer. And if you look at some of the high profile shootings and you read some of the biographies, the backgrounds of the cops, it's like they've had things in their background and they probably shouldn't have been cops. So that's one of the issues. A really bigger kind of issue that I think Nathan was talking about is police culture. And it's different in different places. It's different in different precincts. It's different, but there's something known in police work as the blue code of silence. And that is where you don't want to get your fellow cop in trouble. And so, that is something huge that we talk about at PTI. We even have scenarios where officers have to intervene with someone using excessive force. I mean, we do all kinds of things, but the blue code of silence, I think Laquan McDonald is a very good example of that, where the officer who shot Laquan walking down the middle of the road, in his report, he says he charged me with a knife. And then everybody that was there, his cop buddies, yes, we saw him charge him with a knife. And then about a year later, I think it was, I can't remember, it was Fetterman or somebody that came out with a video, and it's like, yeah, look what really happened. So yeah, police culture is huge, and being accountable are huge. And so I think I'm on the same page.
Real quickly, a great example of what Mike is talking about is the story of Tamir Rice, right? A lot of people don't know that the police officer that shot and killed Tamir Rice was actually fired from another police department, joined the city of Cleveland, I believe it is, police department, and I believe it is less than 30 to 60 days later, he had shot and killed Tamir Rice. And to Mike's point, an additional piece of what I'm advocating for is for every police department to be required to report and document why an officer left. Creating a database. I've actually reached out to the Attorney General of the state of Illinois, encouraging him to create the database, and for officers to, leadership to document why an officer left, but also as an officer's coming in, you check where they may have previously worked, right? I mean, you can check anywhere someone may have worked based upon the social security number, and require these departments to do that check, just like the rest of us have to go through background checks. Before we give someone a gun and a license, we need to make sure that they do a background check as well.
I couldn't agree more. This conversation reminds me of Lieutenant Edwin Raymond in New York City, who he was the whistleblower on New York's quota system. And he's still on the job. He was promoted or what have you, but he caught hell. He and several other officers caught hell for telling on the entire department. And so I agree with both Mike and Nathan. I think that what you tend to see with the blue wall of silence is that being a police officer is a profession. One of the problems with police culture is that many officers tend to take that on as an identity. And that is an issue. And so when you get to dealing with officers who cannot differentiate between themselves as individuals and the department or the field as an entity, that's one of the most toxic issues in police culture. The other thing I think that causes issues, and we talked about education, and Rebecca, you mentioned, some folks say that education won't change the issue. I think that education will change the issue if you cycle in folks who have that education and who are coming in to change the culture. Um, um, you cannot you can't just say, oh, it's one bad apple or it's a couple of bad apples. The culture itself is flawed. And especially when you have folks who are on the job and they see themselves as us versus them. The other piece, I think, is that you have so many folks who come into policing and to, wanting to be correctional officers who have military backgrounds. Now, be clear, I'm not knocking the military. However, when you have a cluster of folks who are coming to public service with a warrior mentality or warrior training, and then you reinforce it with that police culture to say it's us against them, meaning us, the police officers, versus them, the community, you can't expect, rainbows and sunshine when you're having certain interactions in certain spaces. It's common sense.
Thank you, Charlene. This conversation is tying nicely to a question that Janet Guthrie put in the chat. Hey, Janet, nice to have you here. We've been talking about screenings for prospective police officers. Janet asks, what kind of employment screenings and ongoing evaluations can help reinforce the values that Mike has referred to as the guardian model of policing? Any additional thoughts about that?
Yeah, as far as we need policy changes, we need to be more progressive. We need to work harder because, and you have to think of who are you hiring? And I don't have these things in front of me, but there's a lot of new ideas, that places are starting to use. I mean, obviously, if you're going to have your testing and your interviews, and then having interviews with the public and the citizens is a good idea. Doing your background checks is a good idea, but some are saying, well, what if you also started using certain psychological tests to, show where somebody stands in certain areas? What if you would throw in something like, empathy evaluations and racial empathy? And I mean, there's lots of different tests and things and surveys and stuff that you could use. Again, the big fight for that would also be the union. But hiring, it's got to be hiring the right person. It's got to be getting the right training at the academy. And that's part of the hiring process. It's working with your field training officers and who are your field training officers, right? So, and then you're also on probation for a long period of time. So the hiring process is long enough that you should be able to pick up and identify some, red flags and not keep people that shouldn't be kept. But yeah, there's quite a bit out there right now, and I haven't read it in detail, but I'm very interested in that too. That was an excellent question. So whoever said that gets an A.
Hey, Mike, you may be in a better position to push this forward than I can. But one of the things that I've actually been curious about is in that movie, Blade Runner 2049. One of the things that the police officers, I know, right, me and my sci-fi stuff, but they do something very interesting. Before and after a shift, they do something called baseline, where they do an examination of the neurological impact of what has occurred over the shift, right? And in his book, Resmaa Menakem talks about the amount of trauma that police officers experience on a regular basis, right? And that departments are not equipped to help mitigate that trauma. And so what happens is when you have this stored up negative energy from these negative experiences, and then you get into another experience, sometimes that comes out. And that's why you hear the officers say, I meant to do this, and somehow it just totally went left. But beyond telling officers to go get counseling, mandate that they go, but also participate in yoga and other things to help them mitigate some of the trauma that they have. And I strongly believe that it should be investigated that the neuroscience, the University of Illinois has an incredible neurology department. I know because I'd actually visited with this little idea that I had based on Rasmus' book, to help police departments, because I believe that there are police officers that truly intended to do the right thing and it just came out wrong. I mean, I think that's just a human experience. And I think if we can use science to help offset some of that, and again, I'm on my sci-fi tip, but I think we could, again, let's be innovative. Let's explore the possibilities of that.
Absolutely. And I've been working with a couple of other professors, Konstantinos with Yale College of Medicine and Dan Bloomberg, who's been a police psychologist for a long time out in California. And these are exactly the things that we're talking about. And also, if you think about, police learning trauma-informed responses, right? Understanding that who you're interacting with, we don't want to make that trauma worse, but police officers do have trauma, whether it's compassion fatigue, or vicarious trauma, and they go through these things every single day. And if your mental health isn't where it should be and healthy, then you're more likely to make bad decisions. Plus, you're more likely to, a police officer is more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. And so there's a lot of things going on right now, but I'm working with a couple of people who are really focusing on that. So, and yeah.
I want to ask a question that's related here. It's not in the chat, it's my question. So PTI is an example of a progressive training institute, and I'm guessing that there are examples out there of training institutes that are not progressive. I wonder what the process is for accreditation of training institutes, and I wonder if that's a way of eliminating some of the culture that, or of addressing some of the culture that is so destructive, is to ensure that people don't go through training institutes that actually reproduce and generate warriors.
Yes. So what's every state is different, and they all have sort of like their person in charge of all of their academies and police and everything. In Illinois, we have the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. A lot of states have what's called the POST, Police Officer Standards and Training. And so what you're given the curriculum, and everybody can sort of use that and deliver it how they choose to. So if you cover that curriculum and they pass their state written exam, then they're certified. So what I've saw something pop up like, what can we do? Well, we can be positive activists to make change. We can contact our legislators. We can, try to say, hey, we want changing in policing, because there, a number of that paramilitary academy stuff going on all over the United States. And there's others that are more similar to mine. I mean, we're not like the old greatest thing ever in the world. It's not like we invented this stuff, right? Okay, I'm just a regular dude. but yeah, so that's, a lot of it might have to be, like we've had a lot of mandates over the years in Illinois, like every so often you have to have cultural competency, every so often you have to have law update, every so often you have to have these trainings, and it's mandated. And if you don't get them, you can't keep your certification. But to change academy on how it's done, people speak up.
Is that something that would have to be changed through legislation at the state level in each state?
I think it would either have to be through either whoever's in charge of the law enforcement, but then again, I think the legislation can have something to do with it. I think somebody's trying to pass a bill in Illinois, something to do with not having the warrior mentality type training versus the guardian. I mean, it's a fairly ambiguous one that I don't know if it'll go anywhere or not. So yeah, legislation, training boards, and things like that.
Thanks, Mike. I want to invite Charlene to speak.
Just really quickly. I think that And I know Mike said he's just a regular dude, but I think we need more Mike. Because if and I mean that sincerely, we need more mics, because even if a state has specific regulations, it's just like Mike said, if as long as you adhere to that specified curriculum and you pass the exams, then the state is satisfied. But in October, I believe, there was a story that came out of Kentucky where the academy instructor created a 33 slide PowerPoint presentation where he quoted Theodore Roosevelt about a warrior mentality, and he also quoted Adolf Hitler. And so my issue is we can change the way police officers and correctional officers are trained, or we can change the requirements, we can create a curriculum, but if you still have these types of people running the classrooms, nothing will change. And so this came to the attention of Kentucky's governor, Andy Beshear. I really like Andy Beshear. And he found out about it through social media, which was problem number one. But problem number two, this was only exposed because a high school newspaper picked up the story. A high school newspaper. So when I
Future
say,
CNN.
exactly. And so when I say we need more mics, we need more mics to get rid of people like this who are, comfortably and arrogantly promoting, you can't go out and serve and protect communities when you are quoting Adolf Hitler. Like you have to change, the entire machine.
Right. Well, and to echo that sentiment, one of the things that I in terms of the challenges, right? The challenge is the economic incentives that are tied into the current status quo, right? When you look at who benefits from the way things, if nothing changes, nothing, there's no innovation, there's a certain demographic. And again, if our election showed us anything, that there is a segment of people who want things to remain a particular way, right? And we also have to be honest about the economic incentives that are tied into that. Who are the lawyers? Who are the judges? Who are the prosecutors, right? Who are the correctional officers? Where are the facilities located at? Who's building the correctional facilities? Who has contracts with prisons? There is an economic incentive to do these things the way they are, including ankle monitors, right? Electronic monitors, including who gets to be on the commissary, who gets to provide the commissary, who gets to be the doctors and the medical contractors. A lot of this is economically incentivized. So I think there will be some resistance from changing too much from that standpoint. And the other part of that is this: who my wife knows me to be is very different than who you all know
Right.
me to be, right? And so what happens is, when my wife and her friends are around and someone says Nathan's a horrible person, she's like, what are you talking about? And so then the defense of the people who know me from a different context arises. So when you look at the identity of most police officers and leaders and other that, again, and even if it was allegedly said as a joke, what did the police officer tell the white lady that he pulled over? And she said, I'm afraid to reach for my ID in my lap, because and this was 2 days after George Floyd. And the cop jokingly says, oh, don't worry, we only kill black people, right? Well, I was raised, my mom says several truths is told in the form of a joke, right? And so he was subsequently retired or whatever, not voluntarily. But again, it speaks to the point that people are who they are, and you don't know who people are until it comes out. And that's the sad part. You don't know a medical doctor is a horrible neurosurgeon until you're laying open with a cell phone in you from surgery, or a lawyer who, they got their degree from Cracker Jack Box University. Well, you didn't know that until it's too late. And so, that's part of it.
I agree with that. Oh, go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. You were first.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, simply because, and this is going to take this conversation in a completely different direction, but the number of incidences with domestic violence that involve police officers are staggering. You know, I remember there being an article, I want to say it was in the Atlantic some time ago, that questioned, well, if NFL players are, suspended for engaging in abuse, then why don't we suspend police officers? But you could have police officers who may not have excessive force complaints lodged against them. But what happens in the home is a completely different story. And so I guess, again, goes back to, we need more mics, because we need to be able to figure out the ways in which to identify folks who should not be on the job in the first place. That's all I was going to say.
Yeah, and I was just going to kind of add to what Nathan says. It's like, so let's say that, not that you would do this. Let's say you're speeding down the road and I pull you over. All right. So the thing that I really try to push for my recruits, and this is how I policed. First of all, departments have a community policing officer.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. But every single police officer, sergeant, lieutenant, captain on up needs to be a community policing officer. You need to get out on your beat when it's a non-enforcement contact, when it's not a traffic stop, when it's not a domestic, it's not a call for service, and just go up, hey, I'm Officer Mike, how you doing today? And we start having a conversation, and I get to know people as a person. I learn a lot about people, and they learn a lot about me, right? They learn, I have a family. I'm kind of a regular guy. I'm, a Cubs fan because I don't like those Missouri teams like Nathan, but just get to know people as people and be yourself. And then when you do make that traffic stop, it's like, Nathan, how you doing today? Hey, the reason I stopped you is blah, blah, blah. And I know you, but it takes effort but not a lot, right? I mean, sure, sometimes officers are going from call to call to call, and sometimes they're shorthanded and underfunded, and how about when you're off duty? I mean, I went to the youth center when it was on duty. I went to the youth center when I was off duty. I did, you get to know people. And I tell you what, it was a real tragedy not too long ago. For those that live in Champaign might remember reading this obituary, but there was this young man that I saw every day, and he was I shouldn't have favorites at the youth center, but this little kid, and he had not the best family environment, but he had, I talked to him, I mentored him, we talked to him, and then when I retired, he was still fairly young. And then my wife was reading the obituaries in the paper probably 3 months ago, and she says, I don't remember this name, but I remember this nickname. And Rooster, and he was killed in a gang violence gun shooting in Champaign. And wow. Yeah, but it's because I knew him. I mean, and he knew me. It's just sad things like that happen. So I didn't mean to, on a sorry, sad note, but I just wanted to say, get to know your community as people. It's so much more helpful.
And I like that, Mike, but the only thing is, you made a choice to do that. You make a choice to want to get to know people, right? I mean, because again, if you make me go know people, am I really going into it with, that's just like one of the things I tell people, don't ever, when I do diversity and inclusion training, I won't do a mandatory training, because no one really wants to be there, right? And so I was reviewing something back in my hometown, Columbia, Missouri, police officer, and there's a video and all that kind of stuff. And the chief came out and they did their little video, and he talked about the ask, tell, make process. You ask the person to comply, you tell them to comply, and then you make them to comply. right? But my thought as I was going through that, and it wasn't the worst situation. I mean, I get, you can't even really say it's bad compared to, death, right? Um, but what I noticed with that is when he asked the driver to get out of the car, you don't take into consideration you're asking a black man who feels he's done nothing to get out of the car, right? What's going on in his mind versus the police officer's mind, and how that may feel. You're messing with me. I'm getting frustrated. Well, now you look like he said, I'm not getting out of the car and all of this other stuff until you tell me why you pulled me over. Sir, I'm going to ask you to get out of the car. I'm going to make you get out of the car. So it quickly escalated,
Yeah.
which again, that's the training piece. But what wasn't taken into consideration was how afraid was that person to get out of the car.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so these are the things that I think it misses is, like you said, Mike, if you knew this person personally, you're like, hey, such and such, man, step out of the car. And that person wouldn't hesitate to get out of the car because they know you, they trust you, they feel safe. But again, most officers don't do the community policing. They don't believe in it. At least they're trying to get rid of it in my hometown because they don't believe in it. The former police chief had it, the new one sort of, but the union has been very, very extensively opposed to it, saying that the officers don't believe in it.
Yeah.
So-
And just real quick, or who was that? Was somebody else going?
That
Just real
was
quick.
me, and I had a question for you guys, but go ahead.
All right. I was just gonna say, okay, go ahead, Rebecca. I know we're getting close to the end.
Both of you quickly, and then I'm going to have a last question to wrap up. Just
Okay. All right. Don't say rap. I'll start spitting out my rhymes. So, I'm sorry. So when we don't use that method of PTI. If I want you to step out of the car, I'm going to ask you, but I'm going to explain why right away. This is why I need you to do it. If you don't want to get out of the car, I'm going to give you some options. Hey, if you get out of the car, this is why I need you to get out of the car. It's not that big of a deal. Unfortunately, if you don't, this might happen. I don't want it to happen. I'm on your side. And that is a real quick version of a long conversation you should have with some patients with them. So that was almost as fast as my rap god from Eminem, man. Go ahead.
Charlene.
Well, my question was more so along the lines of abolition. And I know that the other day, President Obama was asked about, the phrase defund police, and he said that it wasn't wise to necessarily use that phrase or what have you. And my position is that phrase should not be co-opted by a political party, simply because if you're going to have this conversation about reform and what that looks like, some people are in favor of decreasing police budgets and funding programs that are more community-based, things of that sort. But then there's another section of folks who are completely abolish the police, abolish prisons as well. But that's a whole nother, that's another panel. And so I wanted to know where you think these things factor in, because I don't think it's wise to co-opt that language. It's not fair to co-opt that language, simply because you cannot expect for folks to come to the table and have a conversation about the direction that things need to proceed in, if you are automatically silencing groups that are or positions that are viewed to be extreme.
And I want to jump in here because that was in fact going to be the question that I put to each of you as the final question. Sorry, I don't mean to make you choke.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect. So I want to ask each of you, and maybe we'll end with Charlene, what people can do, getting back to one of the questions in the chat, what regular people can do about this issue, if you think there's a role for them additional to what has already been said, and whether you think that defunding the police is an option that ought to be considered, what that means to you, should you believe it's an option that ought to be considered as we move forward thinking about reducing police violence. And maybe we can go Nathan, Michael, Charlene, and then wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm actually in support of it. Again, my social work background, you've heard the talk about, replacing police officers with social workers, and then that was skewed into, social workers without guns. And that's not at all what we're talking about. What they were talking about was placing some social workers in positions, like again, Columbia, Missouri has community service aid. This person helps out with traffic stops and, small things. But if there's a burglary in progress, the community service aid, a social worker doesn't go to that, right? So that's the first thing. The other thing is we got to look at the history with the police officer merging into the warrior mentality institutionally occurred with Alexander, the new Jim Crow book that talks about with Reagan and getting the excess military stuff being given to police departments. Well, guess what? Now you need training to operate those. You need equipment modifications. So you need money and funding for all of these things, right? And that changes the mindset. And so what I heard from the defund the police is stop adopting those mindset that causes the shift in culture to be less community oriented and more punitive in terms of, engagement styles and strategies. But at the same time, it goes back to what we talked about, the liaison between the economic incentives, such things such as private prisons, which governments agree to have them 85% at capacity. Well, guess who has to do the arresting to get them filled at 85%, right? These are the kind of things that people are talking about with defunding the police. Is really change the system, right? And with all due respect, I don't agree with former President Barack Obama. I listen to more people like Cori Bush, the new elected senator out of St. Louis, who ran and talked about defund the police, hold police officers accountable. But when police officers do a good job, give them a shout out and give them accommodations for the good job that they do. So I think it should be a balance in terms of peel this down a little bit to where it's more manageable, because clearly it's out of control. But then once it gets in control and once people are doing a good job, give them a pat on the back, give them kudos. Again, it's not all about getting rid of all police officers and all police officers are bad and all of that. No one said that, right? I mean, that's just like when people say Black Lives Matter. No one said no one else matters. Right. But again, the lenses through which people hear things is the problems. Not so much what was said, it's what you heard. Because when someone says defund the police, oh, they're trying to get rid of all of them. No, they're saying reduce the funding and shift that to more a community-oriented social workers, things like that. So,
thank you, Nathan. Mike, when you answer the question, I wonder if you could take into account Janet Guthrie's question in the chat. She wants to know if you can speak to the 10 shared principles of policing, if you're familiar with it.
Well, I could if I had that paper with me, and it has 10 wonderful things that a lot of agencies are starting to adopt. It's probably over here somewhere. And I think somebody brought that up where we could find them. And I think all of the local agencies around here are adopting a lot of that. Okay, so yes, we're good with that. And I think Nathan's right, because we have this confirmation bias, and we just always want to find information that agrees with us and disregard information that we don't agree with. And we're so strong on, and the more emotional the issues are, the stronger we are for something or against something. And the phrase defunding the police makes every cop, not every cop, I can't speak for all cops, okay, but makes a lot of cops like, you're going to get rid of us. And then when I'm talking to police officers, I said, we know the majority of police officers out there are good people, want to do the job for the good, right reasons. But don't use that phrase, a few bad apples. That simple little phrase alone, like, oh, there's a few bad apples, even if I said, well, there's a few bad apples, but we've got a lot of issues. But if you said something like, nah, that makes it sound like that, there's a few bad apples, we're not that big of a deal. And as far as defunding goes, I want to see more funds go to social work, mental health, homeless, everything, and all of that. but I want there to be enough funding for police agencies to do the better trainings and the mandates and all these things that will make them better. And I worry sometimes where you take too much and then have that social work and all this other stuff in there where you're not able to create the best cops because they're still doing stuff too. So I'm a little varied on that from, I think, maybe from others, but I get Nathan, it's almost like a mindset ideology kind of thing. So, but I guess I was trying to be fast, but that didn't answer it. Please say so and I'll answer it better. I know we're on a time crunch.
Thank you, Mike. And I see Nathan's comment in the chat. I appreciate that too. Charlene, I think you can take it home for us.
I agree with Nathan and Mike. I think that, again, I disagree with President Obama. You can't silence someone's views just because you don't like the language that frames it. I think that being able to listen to these concerns, to listen to what people want, and it's like Nathan said, you know, what does defunding the police mean? It means something to different people. You know, but we cannot focus on those three words, on the phrase. If we focus on the phrase, we're not going to get anywhere. It's just going to be a roundabout argument. But folks need to come to the table and listen to, and for those who do want police abolition, listen as to why. Listen as to why. And it's the same way with prison abolition. Why do people want to abolish these systems? They clearly feel like there's fault, they're not working, but you won't be able to tackle the issues if you don't sit and are able to have a civic conversation, because we all live here. It's not like we live in silos. And so if your neighbor is for complete abolition, but you are not, then sit down with that neighbor. You know, politicians need to do the same. We all need to do the same thing. And that we get so hung up on language and who says what, that we're not getting to the root or the efforts of change.
Can I throw in my book?
Yes.
The Anatomy of Peace. Read it. That's all I got to say.
And I'll draw out my final thank you so someone has a chance to put that in the chat, because I love the fact that there are books and newspaper articles and magazine articles that we're referring the audience to. Charlene Fletcher, Mike Schlosser, Nathan Phillips, Stevens. I've known you so long. I know your name is Nathan Stevens. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm really glad we were able to meet again. Thank you to everyone who attended this evening and participated. And I hope you got something out of the conversation. Thank you to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign Library System for hosting this series of talks and for inviting us back. Jessica or Sarah, do you want to say anything in closing?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And just to give you a little bit more information, the University of Illinois has been a part of this, but it's also been a collaboration with other public libraries within the central Illinois area. So just want to say a big thank you for everyone who has been a part of this. And of course, to Sarah Christensen for coordinating all of this. And one of the goals of coming together was we wanted to pull our think about some of the resources that libraries have, but also to find ways to have more in-depth discussion than just constantly thinking of a reading list. And so it's just been wonderful to have all the speakers and to really hear about the impact of real life experiences and how that's even kind of channeled into some of your academic work. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yay, libraries.
Hey, good job, Rebecca. You rock.
You guys all rock. It's a pleasure and an honor. Everybody be safe and be healthy.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Peace out.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.